You told your therapist you're scared you'll lose the kids because you're not stable enough. Those are your words, Sabrina, word for word. So don't stand here and tell me you're the better parent. Sabrina Doyle felt her stomach drop straight through the kitchen floor. She hadn't told Garrick that. She'd told exactly one person that, behind a closed door, in a room with soft lighting and a white noise machine humming outside, in a session she'd paid $200 to believe was private. "How do you know that?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Garrick just smiled, the same smile he used to give her across a dinner table before everything went rotten. "Lucky guess," he said. It wasn't a lucky guess. And by the time Sabrina figured out exactly how unlucky it was, she'd already handed her ex-husband a folder full of her deepest fears. Tied up with a bow, delivered straight to his lawyer by the one person who was supposed to be in her corner. This is the story of how she found out and how she made sure the woman who sold her out never got to call herself a therapist again. Sabrina and Garrick had been married for 11 years when the cracks turned into canyons. 2 kids, Jonah, who was 8, and Adeline, who was 5, and a marriage that had been running on fumes for at least 3 of those years. Garrick worked in commercial real estate, made good money, traveled a lot, and somewhere in the traveling, he'd started disappearing on weekends that didn't line up with any deals Sabrina could find a paper trail for. She wasn't stupid, she just didn't want to be right. When she finally confronted him, he didn't deny it so much as shrug it off, like she'd caught him leaving dishes in the sink instead of catching him in an affair. "I'm not talking about this like it's a crime scene," he told her once. "People grow apart, Sabrina." They tried counseling first, Garrick's idea, which in hindsight should have been her first red flag. He came home one night with a name and a number already written on a sticky note like he'd done his homework. "Dr. Cole," he said. "She's supposed to be excellent, specializes in couples on the edge of divorce. A guy at work recommended her." Annalise Cole had an office in a converted brownstone with exposed brick and a candle that always smelled like eucalyptus. She was warm in that practiced, unhurried way therapists are trained to be, nodding at the right moments, repeating things back with just enough rephrasing to sound insightful. "It sounds like you're carrying a lot of fear about the future," she said to Sabrina in their second session, and Sabrina remembers feeling, for one stupid, grateful moment, like she'd finally found someone who was actually listening. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know for another 4 months, was that Annalise had grown up 2 streets over from Garrick, back in a small town neither of them talked about much anymore. They'd gone to the same high school. Prom photos existed somewhere in a box. They'd fallen out of touch the way people do, until Garrick showed up at a mutual friend's barbecue 18 months earlier, mentioned his marriage was falling apart, and Annalise, freshly divorced herself, still sore about a custody arrangement she felt had gone against her, had said something like, "You should come see me. Professionally, I mean." She'd laughed when she said it. He hadn't. The counseling sessions were supposed to be joint, Sabrina and Garrick together, working through things. But early on, Annalise suggested splitting some sessions into individual time. "It's common practice," she explained. "Sometimes people need a space to say things they're not ready to say in front of their partner." It sounded reasonable. It sounded honestly like relief. Sabrina had things she wanted to say without Garrick's face doing that flinching thing it did whenever she got too honest. So she talked. She talked about how scared she was that the kids would end up shuffled between 2 houses on a spreadsheet schedule. She talked about how she sometimes lay awake doing math. Could she afford the house on her salary alone? Could she keep Jonah in the same school district? Would Adeline remember a version of her family that wasn't broken? She talked about a panic attack she'd had in a grocery store parking lot that she'd never told anyone about, not even her sister. She talked about feeling, some nights, like she wasn't cut out for single motherhood, like maybe Garrick was right that she was too anxious to handle it alone. She said all of that inside 4 walls she believed were soundproof in every sense that mattered. The first time something felt off, it was small enough to explain away. Garrick, sitting across from her at a mediation meeting about the kids' summer schedules, said out of nowhere, "You're worried you can't afford to keep them in the house. I get that. But maybe it's better for everyone if we just sell it now, instead of you stretching yourself thin trying to prove a point." Sabrina blinked. She hadn't said anything to him about affording the house. She'd said it to Annalise 3 days earlier. "How did you know I was worried about that?" she asked. "You've mentioned it before," Garrick said smoothly. "You worry about money, Sabrina. It's not exactly a secret." She let it go. People do that. They let the first one go because the alternative is believing something too ugly to hold. The second time was harder to explain away. It was during a custody hearing prep call with her own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Fenwick Cole who'd been recommended by a coworker. Garrick's lawyer had submitted a filing that referenced, almost verbatim, a phrase Sabrina had used in therapy just the week before. Something about feeling like I'm failing them just by existing some days. She hadn't said that to Fenwick. She hadn't said it to anyone but Annalise. "This is oddly specific," Fenwick said, scanning the filing with narrowed eyes. "Where would opposing counsel get language like this?" "I don't know," Sabrina said, but something cold was already crawling up the back of her neck. The third time erased any benefit of the doubt. It happened in her own kitchen, over a conversation about picking up Jonah from soccer practice, when Garrick, completely unprompted, brought up the panic attack in the grocery store parking lot. The one she'd never told a living soul about except Annalise, in a session 4 months earlier, crying into a tissue while the eucalyptus candle burned on the side table. "Maybe you should get that looked at," he said, almost gently, almost like he cared. "The anxiety thing. I don't want the kids around that if it gets worse." Sabrina stood very still in her own kitchen and felt something in her chest go quiet and sharp at the same time. "Garrick," she said, "how do you know about that?" And that's when he said it. The line that opened this whole story, the one about her not being stable enough, delivered word for word, like he was reading off a transcript instead of remembering a conversation he was never in the room for. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed running back through every session, every detail she'd handed over, believing it would stay locked in that brownstone office, and one name kept surfacing like a stone she couldn't stop turning over. Annalise. The next morning, she called Fenwick. "I think my therapist is talking to my husband," Sabrina said, and even saying it out loud sounded insane, like something from a soap opera, not from her actual life. Fenwick didn't laugh it off, which Sabrina would be grateful for later. "Therapists have an ethical and legal obligation to keep session content confidential, barring a few narrow exceptions," she said. "If that's happening, it's not just a betrayal, it's a violation we can use, but we need proof, not a feeling. Feelings don't move a judge." "How do I get proof?" "You request your full records," Fenwick said. "In writing. Every note, every session log, everything Dr. Hart Cole has on file for you. You're entitled to it. And Sabrina, request it soon, before she has time to think about cleaning anything up." Sabrina sent the request that same afternoon, hands shaking as she typed it, phrasing it as formally as she could manage, copying Fenwick on the email. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Annalise's office cited administrative delays. Sabrina started to wonder if this was the sound of stalling for time to scrub a hard drive. While she waited, the custody case moved forward, and it kept getting worse in ways that felt too precise to be coincidence. In a hearing about the kids' schedule, Garrick's attorney referenced Sabrina's documented history of anxiety-driven parenting decisions, a phrase that made the judge's eyebrows lift and made Sabrina's stomach turn to ice. She hadn't told anyone about specific parenting decisions being influenced by anxiety. She'd told Annalise in vague, exploratory language about a moment she'd second-guessed herself picking Adeline up from a birthday party. It was being twisted, weaponized, turned into ammunition, dressed up as clinical concern. "He's building a narrative," Fenwick said afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, voice low and controlled but eyes hard, "that you're unstable, anxious, unfit, and he's building it out of material he shouldn't have access to. If we can prove where it's coming from, we don't just win the case. We blow it up entirely. Because a case built on tainted evidence doesn't just lose, it gets thrown out." 6 weeks after her request, the records finally arrived, a thick manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have in Sabrina's hands. She sat at her kitchen table that night, Jonah and Adeline already asleep upstairs, and read through months of her own life summarized in someone else's clinical handwriting. Some of it was fine. Generic, almost suspiciously generic, actually, bland summaries of sessions that Sabrina remembered being raw and specific. But some of it wasn't fine at all. Some of it was worse than she'd imagined. Buried in the notes from the session where she'd talked about the grocery store parking lot panic attack, Annalise had written, "Patient reports increasing episodes of anxiety that may impact caregiving capacity. Recommend monitoring for potential impact on custody suitability." Sabrina read that line 4 times. She had never said anything about her ability to be a caregiver being impacted. That wasn't a summary. That was a plant, language built for a courtroom, not a treatment plan. Worse, comparing dates against her calendar, she found 2 entries logged as individual session S. Doyle on days she had definitely not been in that office. She'd been at Jonah's school for a parent-teacher conference on one of those dates. She had the sign-in sheet to prove it. "She's fabricating sessions," Sabrina said to Fenwick over the phone, hands trembling around the papers. "There are notes for appointments that never happened." "Then she's not just unethical," Fenwick said. "She's committing fraud. And if she's inventing sessions, I'd bet real money she's also communicating with Garrick outside of any documented channel. We need her phone records or emails or something that puts them in contact directly." "Do you know if they know each other outside of the office?" Sabrina didn't. Not yet. But something in her remembered a detail from years ago. Garrick mentioning a friend from back home who'd become a therapist, told in passing at a dinner party, so long ago Sabrina hadn't thought about it since. She dug through old photos and old social media, and there it was, a tagged photo from nearly 2 decades earlier, a high school prom, Garrick in an ill-fitting rented tux, arm around a girl in a green dress. The tag carried a maiden name Sabrina didn't recognize, until she cross-referenced it against a name change buried in a professional licensing database. Annalise, it turned out, had gone by a different last name once, Rayburn. And Annalise Rayburn had gone to prom with Garrick, rented tux and all. Sabrina sat with that for a long time. It wasn't just a betrayal by a stranger who happened to be careless with confidentiality. It was a plan. A childhood friend doing a childhood friend a very ugly favor, dressed up as clinical care. Fenwick moved fast once they had the connection. She filed a motion alerting the court potential undisclosed conflict of interest and evidence tampering. Attaching the doctored records, the fabricated session dates, and the prom photo as circumstantial but compelling context. The judge, a sharp, unflappable woman named Celine Ferreira, who did not appear to enjoy being lied to in her own courtroom, ordered an immediate pause on the custody proceedings pending investigation. "I want to be very clear," Judge Ferreira said, addressing both attorneys. "If it turns out this court has been relying on evidence generated through an undisclosed personal relationship and fabricated documentation, everything built on that foundation gets reconsidered. All of it." Garrick's face, Sabrina noted with some satisfaction, had gone the color of old paper. Sabrina filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board the same week, attaching everything: the doctored notes, the fabricated appointment dates, the prom photo, a sworn statement from Fenwick outlining the pattern, and a timeline matching every coincidental detail Garrick had surfaced back to a specific therapy session. The board assigned an investigator, a meticulous woman named Ifeoma Okafor, who called Sabrina personally to walk through the complaint. "This is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen," Ifeoma told her. "Usually these things are messy. He said, she said, no paper trail. You gave us a paper trail." The investigation moved faster than Sabrina expected, mostly because once the board subpoenaed Annalise's phone records, the evidence built itself. Text messages between Annalise and Garrick going back over a year, some sent minutes after sessions ended. One message, sent 40 minutes after a session where Sabrina had cried about the parking lot panic attack, read, "She's more fragile than you think. Use it. Judges eat this up." Another, sent the night before a custody hearing, "Don't mention I told you this part. Just work it into your testimony naturally." When Fenwick read that second text aloud in a follow-up hearing, the courtroom went dead quiet. Even Garrick's attorney looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Annalise tried to explain herself when the board brought her in for a formal hearing. She sat across from a panel of 5 people, her composure cracking around the edges in a way Sabrina almost didn't recognize. The eucalyptus candle calm was gone. "I was trying to help a friend going through a difficult situation," Annalise said. "I never intended for anyone to be harmed." One of the panel members, an older man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, looked at her flatly. "You fabricated clinical records. You disclosed confidential patient information for use in a custody dispute. You did this for over a year. What outcome did you think this would have, if not harm?" Annalise didn't have an answer for that, not one that held up anyway. The board didn't just reprimand her. They revoked her license entirely, citing violations of confidentiality, fabrication of clinical records, and conflict of interest so severe it undermined the basic trust the entire profession depends on. It wasn't a quiet revocation either. The board's findings became part of the public record, and a local news outlet picked up the story a few weeks later under a headline that made Sabrina's chest loosen for the first time in months. License revoked. Therapist fed private session details to patient's ex for custody leverage. Annalise's practice, the one with the exposed brick and the candle, closed within 2 months. Sabrina heard secondhand, through the strange small-world grapevine that exists in every town, that Annalise had moved out of state, that no one would return her calls when she tried to find work in an adjacent field, that Dr. Cole had quietly become a name people typed into search engines before deciding not to hire her for anything involving trust. The custody case, once reopened, didn't take long to resolve once the tainted evidence was formally excluded. Judge Ferreira was blunt about it in her ruling. The court cannot and will not consider testimony or filings built on information obtained through a documented ethical breach. Doing so would reward exactly the kind of manipulation this case has uncovered. Garrick's entire narrative, built brick by brick out of Sabrina's stolen vulnerability, collapsed the moment its foundation was pulled out. What remained, once you stripped away the fabricated instability, was a fairly ordinary divorce between 2 ordinary parents. And Sabrina walked out of that courtroom with primary custody, a support order that actually reflected Garrick's income instead of a low-balled figure his attorney had tried to sneak through, and something else that mattered more than any of it: the quiet, solid knowledge that nobody in that room believed she was unfit anymore. Least of all her. Garrick tried once, outside the courthouse, to say something to her, some version of an apology that sounded more like damage control. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "Annalise said it would help. I didn't think about what it would do to you." Sabrina looked at him for a long moment, Jonah's hand in one of hers, Adeline on her hip. "You didn't think about what it would do to me," she repeated. "The same way you didn't think about what it would do to your kids, watching you try to take their mother apart in a courtroom, using her own pain as ammunition. I hope it was worth it." She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. A few months later, Sabrina sat in a new therapist's office. Someone Fenwick had recommended, someone with 0 connections to anyone in her old life. Before Sabrina had even settled into the chair, the woman was already talking. "I want to walk you through exactly what confidentiality means, legally, and the narrow exceptions to it before we start," she said. "You should know exactly what you're protected by in this room." Sabrina almost laughed, then almost cried. It felt like being handed a glass of water after a very long walk through a desert. She still thinks about Annalise sometimes, not with rage anymore, mostly with a kind of cold clarity. A woman who let an old friendship, and maybe some leftover bitterness from her own custody fight, talk her into throwing away a career built on trust. The kind of betrayal that doesn't just wreck one marriage. It poisons the well for everyone who ever needed to believe a locked office door actually meant something. If you were in Sabrina's shoes, finding out the one person who was supposed to help you save your marriage was quietly helping tear it apart instead, would you have caught on as fast as she did? Or would the coincidences have slipped right past you? Tell us what you'd have done in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. there's always another reckoning coming.